One thing I haven't talked about that much in my time as your pastor is my heritage. My family is super German. We're extremely German. On my dad's side, my last name, Manschreck, is very, very German. And of course, when I was growing up, I was told if you want to be authentic in your pronunciation, you have to say it as if you were gargling rocks, right? Like you have to be like, Manschreck. Apparently, Schreck is the word for fear in German, and Man is just for man. And so our name either means man who is afraid or man who is feared. I still don't know which one I want. On my mom's side of the family, I'm a third-generation immigrant. My grandmother is actually from the old country, a direct immigrant to America. But here's the thing. Growing up, I have this rich German history in my background, but nobody ever told me it was German. I didn't know that the things we did were specifically from that cultural background. Here's an example. When I was growing up, my mom's mom, her name was Oma. And I thought that was her actual name. That's what we call her. Her name is Oma. Now, I didn't know this, but Oma is actually the German word for grandma, but I thought it was literally her name. Oma means grandma. I was like a teenager before I found out that connection. And one time at Christmas, my Oma, she brought us some chocolate. And now Oma brought us chocolate from her visit to Germany. She went back to Germany to visit family, and she came and she brought us chocolate. And I remember when she gave us the chocolate, I remember I was a little kid and I ate it, and I was like, ugh, Oma, this chocolate is gross. I want the Hershey bar over there. She was so offended. She was so angry and upset. And I couldn't figure it out. I was like, what is the big deal? It's candy. That Hershey bar is bigger, right? And this thing you gave me, it's too rich. It's too much. But my Oma, she was trying to, it was like good German dark chocolate is what she had handed me. And she's trying to explain to me that Hershey stuff, that's garbage, right? You come from a world of good chocolate. I want you to know what good chocolate is. Now, as an adult, I still love that plastic garbage chocolate that Hershey spits out. I love it because I'm an American. But I now know that there's this whole world of rich German chocolates that's incredible. Our heritage is a part of our story. And one of the things I regret from my childhood is that I didn't ask more questions. I wish I had asked. One of the things we would do when I was a kid during Christmas, and if you guys are German, maybe you've done something like this, we would do this tradition where you take your shoes and you leave them outside your door on Christmas Eve, or on the 12 days leading up to Christmas. Does anybody know this tradition at all? Where you put the shoes outside? That's a thing. Some people know it. Okay, and then you wake up in the morning, and there's candy in your shoe. It was kind of like an advent calendar or the 12 days of Christmas, but stinkier, right? There's candy in my shoe. Now, little 6-year-old JJ, did he ever ask, why? Why is there candy in my shoe? Did I ever wonder, what's the story? What's the connection to my past? Nope. As soon as I found the candy, wrappers on the floor, chocolates in my cheek. And that is why you don't let children go trick-or-treating unsupervised. We don't ask questions, we just eat, right? And we just do that. But there is a story behind almost every cultural and family tradition. But so many of us, we have lost the curiosity about our past. And if we lose that curiosity, then we lose the why of our tradition. And then eventually, if we can't remember why we do something, we will lose the tradition. I used to wonder, okay, but why is my German heritage such a big deal for my Oma? I mean, my dad's side of the family is super German too, but they don't make a big deal about it. They're just Americans, right? We're not German. Have you seen the movies? Germans are usually the bad guys, right? We don't want to be associated with that. But why do we make a big deal of chocolate and using the German language? But then I heard my grandmother's story, and it started to make a little bit more sense to me. You see, my great-grandparents were missionaries from Germany to China. They were Christian missionaries, and my grandmother was actually born in China on the mission field. Nationality-wise, she's what you would call a white Chinese person. She was there, and she grew up in China. But then when things got bad during World War II, China got real hostile to Christians, especially evangelists and missionaries. And so my Oma and her sister, when they were little girls, they got separated from their parents. My great-grandparents got on a boat from China, and they fled to the safety of America. But my Oma and her sister, when they were little girls, they got on the wrong boat, and they headed up back to the homeland, back to Germany during World War II. My grandmother grew up in an orphanage in Germany during World War II while her parents were in America. And then eventually they had to flee the orphanage because of all the bombs, and they went to live out in the countryside, living on the farms, filling in and doing the manual labor left by the men who went to war. And after the war was over, my Oma and her sister would come, they reunited with her parents at Ellis Island as German immigrants to America, and they began their life here. And even now, in my modern adult life, I still only know broad strokes of the story. I wish I'd been more curious. I wish I had asked more questions, sought the why behind all these goofy traditions. The same thing happens in church life, too. We come into this place, and we have all these traditions, all right, decorations, worship formats, traditional prayers, Sabbath, Christian education, tithing, offering, volunteering. And for so many of us, we do it because it's what you've always done. And that's what we told our children. And so we forgot the why of our religious traditions. And if you forget the why, eventually you will lose the tradition itself. If you want to know why so many young people aren't in church anymore, I think a part of it is because they don't get it. They don't understand the why, and so they don't hang on to the tradition. And actually, we see the same thing in our scripture lesson for today. Let's take a look. Now, Exodus chapter 12. If you were here last week, we already covered the first couple verses of the chapter, explaining the sacrifice and the Passover. God freed his people from slavery. So now we're starting out in verse 14. And it says, "This day will be a memorial for you, and you must celebrate it as a festival to the Lord. You are to celebrate it throughout your generations as a permanent statute. You must eat unleavened bread for 7 days. And on the first day, you must remove the yeast from your houses. Whoever eats what is leavened on the first through the seventh day must be cut off from Israel. You are to hold a sacred assembly on the first day, and another sacred assembly on the seventh day. No work can be done on those days except for preparing what people need to eat. You may do only that." So basically, this is what we call the Festival of the Unleavened Bread. It's a week-long party in Jewish tradition where you're not allowed to do any work except prepare more food. And that is my kind of festival, right? Like, that's awesome. That sounds so great. No working, just food all week. Oh yeah, and then there's this thing about yeast. No leavened bread. There's no bread. Everything has to be unleavened. Everything has to be without yeast. They even go so far as to take all the yeast out of the house before the big party. Verse 21, it says, "Then Moses summoned all the elders and said to them, 'Go, select an animal from the flock according to your families, slaughter the Passover animal. Take a cluster of hyssop,'" which is like a branch from a tree, "hyssop, dip it in the blood that's in the basin, and brush the lintel and the 2 doorposts with some of the blood that's in the basin. None of you may go out the door of his house until morning. When the Lord passes through to strike Egypt and sees the blood on the lintel and the 2 doorposts, he will pass over the door and not let the destroyer enter your houses to strike you." So this is what we talked about last week. The blood on the doorpost is recognition that the wages of sin is death and judgment's going to pass over that house. But listen to the next part, what he says next. It says in verse 24, "Keep this as a command permanently as a statute for you and your descendants. When you enter into the land that the Lord gave you as he promised, you are to observe this ceremony. And when your children ask you, 'What does this ceremony mean to you?' you are to reply, 'This is the Passover sacrifice to the Lord, for he passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt when he struck the Egyptian, and he spared our homes.' So the people knelt low and worshiped." When your children ask, "What does this ceremony mean to you?" And then it tells them what to say. It says, no, tell them it's the Passover sacrifice because God's judgment passed over us. And I like to imagine this Jewish tradition, right? It's grandparents and great-grandparents that are all gathered in the house. It's a big holiday celebration, and the kids are running around as they always do on a holiday celebration. And then it's like grandpa grabs a kid who's running by and sits him on his knee and says, okay, let me tell you the story. You see what your mom's doing there? See what your dad's doing? He's got that branch from the tree, and they're painting the doorposts. Let me tell you the story of why you are free. Why you are living in freedom. You see how she's painting the door with blood? And I guess what I'm seeing in this first chunk of the Bible lesson is that parents and grandparents have a responsibility to tell the stories that come behind our tradition so that our children will understand the why. Over the past few generations in modern America, we have lost the power of our traditions because we lost the why, and we lost the stories that come behind those traditions. Now, verses 14 to 28, that gives us the tradition, and then the stuff before and after gives us the story. It kind of comes over and over in waves to mention what happened and why. The two traditions we get in this story is, number one, the blood on the doorposts, and number two, the unleavened bread. Now, blood on the doorpost, that's easy. We know what that one is, right? Judgment passes over. But as for the unleavened bread, when the 10th plague came in, Pharaoh was done. He says, get out. And we pick it up in verse 33. And it says, now the Egyptians pressured the people in order to send them quickly out of the country. For they said, we're all going to die. And so the people took their dough before it was leavened, with their kneading bowls wrapped up in their clothes on their shoulders. The Israelites acted on Moses' word and asked the Egyptians for silver and gold and items of clothing. And the Lord gave them such favor that the Egyptians that gave them what they requested. And in this way they plundered the Egyptians. The reason this is called the Festival of the Unleavened Bread, because they didn't have time to let the bread rise. The Egyptians were so freaked out that they drove the Israelites out of the land. Here, just take my gold, take my silver, take my clothes, just get out. Because we don't want to die. Israel barely had time to grab their coats and grab this dough that's not ready. They're like, wrap it up in your clothes and throw it on your shoulder. It's not risen, it's unleavened, and that's what they eat. At the beginning of the chapter, verse 11, it actually goes in more depth. It says, here is how you must eat the Passover meal they're talking about. He says, you must be dressed for travel, with sandals on your feet, your staff in your hand, and you are to eat it in a hurry, because it's the Lord's Passover. So it's not just a festival celebration, but it's like, you got to eat it really fast, and you got to eat it with your shoes on. Can you imagine a kid's question about this traditional? Grandma, why do I have to wear my shoes for dinner? Right? Why do I have my coat on right now? And it's like, well, let me tell you the story. In your history, in your heritage, the situation was really rough. And God told us, pack your bags ahead of time. We're going to eat this meal really fast, bread that doesn't even have time to rise because we got to get out of here. Verse 40, it says, the time the Israelites lived in Egypt was 430 years. And at the end of 430 years, on that same day, all the Lord's military divisions went out from the land of Egypt. It was a night of vigil in honor of the Lord because he would bring them out of the land of Egypt. This same night is in honor of the Lord, a night vigil for all the Israelites throughout their generations. Can you imagine that first night that freedom came to the Israelites? They're like, we hold this celebration, we eat a strange meal, we eat it in a weird way, we paint the doorposts with some blood, and then they hold a vigil. And in my mind, you can't have a vigil without candlelights, right? So it's a candlelight vigil when I imagine it. And I just imagine these Jewish families sitting around, holding their candles in the dark, reflecting on what it means, that first journey out of Egypt. The oppression was over. Their people are free. And the thing in our scripture that really captured my attention is this idea of children asking the question, why do we do this? And it's so important to pass on these traditions. But I was also reading some scholars, and they were talking about how this whole story could be a metaphor in our lives. Great traditions don't just point us backwards. They also apply and change our lives right now. They affect our future. With this story, the Exodus of Israel, if Egypt and Pharaoh represent oppression and all forms of evil, right? And that's absolutely what Egypt represents. This grand story, Egypt represents evil. The message of the story of the unleavened bread is that we need to get away from evil in our lives as quickly as possible, right? There's a quote from one of the commentaries. It says, "When the community of faith no longer has the festival of urgent departure, it runs the risk of being excessively and in unseemly ways at home in the empire." What that means is if we don't teach our children that if you are living in the land of sin and evil, you got to get out of there as quickly as possible, if we don't teach them that, they might end up getting a little too comfortable with evil. We are not supposed to be comfortable in Egypt. We're not supposed to be comfortable with oppression and darkness and evil. We need our traveling shoes on. We run away from those things. We don't want to stay. We don't want to get comfortable in the land of Egypt. We are not children of that land, the place that enslaves people for hundreds of years and slaughters generation out of fear with an intent to suppress. We are the children of the marked doorpost. We are the children of the hurried bread. And we will follow God to freedom. It's not just a tradition. It's not just a story from back then. This is a method and a means to everyday life right now. Let me ask you, do you have sin in your life? Something you know you're not supposed to be doing. And we were going to run away from it. We were going to stop. But then you decided to let it hang out in your life for a little bit. And we got a little more comfortable in the empire. A little more comfortable living in the land of Egypt. The message of the Passover celebration is not just that through Jesus' judgment is passed over you, but also that you got to get out of there. If there is evil in your world, you need to drop everything and get out of there. Don't wait for the bread to be done rising. Follow God to freedom in your life right now. Set your eyes on the horizon. Repent of the evil that's in your life and never look back. Leave that darkness behind you in the land of oppression because you are following the true God of Israel out of the slavery and into the light. You see, the good news coming out of the text this morning is that God reveals himself in our pieces of worship. Practically every single thing around you is there for a reason. The cross, the table, the candles, the stained glass windows. I mean, there's whole stories inside inside those windows. I mean, the music. You open up those red hymnals in front of you. I know we don't really use them anymore, but if you open it up, every single page in there's a teaching about God. It's not just the church building. It's everything in your faith walk. It's a tradition that has a story behind it, a reason that we do it that teaches us and helps us and guides us. We have constructed our entire religious expression out of a pile of narratives to help us understand one thing. There is a God out there, and he cares about you. But when you take the traditions and you forget the stories, you forget why we do this. You don't have the curiosity to say, Grandma, why do we do this? The traditions become hollow. And then it's just stuff you do, just for no reason. And when that happens, then the criticisms start. They'll say things like, well, those religious people, all that religious hokum, it's just about control. They just want to control people, or it's all about money. They just want your money, or it's all about hatred. They just want to hate people, and they want to use religion to justify their hatred. And yeah, if you're dealing with empty traditions, if you have gutted the traditions, forgotten the narratives, forgotten why we do things, and you just do it to do it, yes, you can take those traditions and make them mean whatever you want. And I think there are churches that have traditions that are all about control and hatred and money. And I think the bad examples hit the headlines a whole lot more than the good ones. But here's the thing. If God reveals himself in our pieces of worship, we could create something new. By reclaiming the stories behind all of our traditions, we could create something authentic, a true church who is pursuing God with all of our worship. There are so many people out there who are just freaked out by the church. They have heard every possible explanation of what we do in this place except the real thing. They just make up stories about us, right? There was a kid in our neighborhood a couple of summers ago. I was outside setting up the Gaga pit for a youth event. We were going to go play Gaga ball outside. And I was setting it up, and some of the neighborhood kids came over. And they're like, hey, what is this? And I was like, well, it's a portable Gaga pit. And they helped me set it up, and they said, can we play a game? I said, yeah, I got some time. So I played Gaga ball with the neighborhood kids, right? And at the end of it, I invited them to church. And I said, you guys you're always playing in our parking lot. Y'all live like right just down on the street. And I said, your church is like across the street. You are always welcome to come on in if you ever wanted to come visit. We have a really good time on Sundays. And you know what he said to me? He said, wait, are we allowed to go in that building? Is it free? And I said, yes, of course it's free. Like, you are always welcome in the house of the Lord, but they didn't know. They didn't know, like, maybe I have to pay to come inside, or maybe I already have to be a good person before I'm allowed to come inside. You know what I have found is the biggest difference between like those big growing mega churches and teeny tiny little churches? It's not theology, it's not worship style, it's not even how cool the building looks. Growing churches are the ones who can explain what they do simply. You can take what you're doing and tell people why. They know why they do what they do, and they can explain it to new people. Filling in the stories open up tradition for new people to meet God. Because God reveals himself in worship. And so what we learn, it's not just our responsibility to do stuff, but to understand the why. Tell the stories, reclaim the why. It's the greatest method for ensuring that it will endure as a tradition. There's so many people out there, and they're freaked out by the church. They feel like they're not allowed to come in here because they don't get it. They don't know why we're doing what we're doing. But if you can explain it to them, you can make them feel welcome, and they will love being a part of this. We just have to learn how to explain it to people. So the challenge for us today, the way we can apply it to our lives is, number one, you got to learn the stories. Reclaim the curiosity of your faith. Grandma, why do we do it this way? There's always a reason. There's always a story. And if all you know is, well, we've always done it that way, then don't talk to that person anymore, right? Go ask someone else, because there is a story. There is a reason behind just about everything we do. Keep searching. Reclaim the curiosity in your faith journey. Learn the stories of our walk with God. Honestly, that moment where I sat up here for children's time and just asked them, those kids know the story. I was like, why is that? Why is that? And they knew the answers. They were like, well, we have the lamb because of this. They had multiple answers for that one. Well, we knew the cross because of this. We have the cross here and the candles, and everything has a reason. I think about the church historian, Jim Thomas, who was up here last week, 180 years of church. This isn't just about like our faith tradition as Christians, but about this specific church. Why do we do some of the things we do in this place that nobody else is doing? Pillowcases. Why do we got pillowcases all over this church? And you could say, it's just what we do. We always have done it. It's like, no, there's an amazing story and reason that we do these things. Tell people that. We should be proud. The things that we need to learn and then tell to other people. Learn the stories, tell the stories. The second challenge I have for you applies to this specific picture, the story of Egypt. The second challenge that I have for you today is to hurry up and get out of Egypt. If you are living in the land of sin, if you are living in the land of oppression, the land of darkness, get out of there. Right? Don't wait for the bread to rise. Wrap it up in your clothes, put it on your shoulders, and get out of there. Hurry up and get out of Egypt, because freedom is waiting for you. Growing up in my very German household, I missed out on stuff because I lacked the curiosity to ask the basic question that every kid should ask. Grandma, why do we do this? Is Oma your real name? Why is there chocolate in my shoes? But if we can reclaim the stories of our past, our traditions, they could be more than just a hollow shell. It becomes easier to share that with the rest of the world. And so I'll leave you with this. May you reclaim the curiosity of your faith. Ask the question, Grandma, why do we do this? May you learn the stories of your walk with God. Learn the stories and then tell them to everyone around you. And if at any point in those stories you find yourself in Egypt, hurry up and get out of there. Amen.